Hello and welcome back to the Quantum Podcast, people of the internet. My name is Ethan Morland and I'm the host of the podcast, and I aim to speak to high performers about the hows and the whys behind what they do and break it down with them. On today's episode of the podcast, I have a very interesting guest on. His name is Graham Tuttle and he is also known as the Barefoot Sprinter online. Today's episode went very different to how I thought it would. I went into this podcast with 1,001 questions for Graham about his methodologies, his training style, his thoughts on shoes, because obviously being the Barefoot Sprinter, everything's about using the feet and everything connects to the feet. And although we did speak about that, it wasn't just about that. There was many things that we sort of went off, and it was more of a conversation, talking about pain. We spoke about the use of orthotics and why they can be a life sentence for certain people when you don't have a regression out of them. All these different things that we spoke about, and he's just a very insightful person, and you can see why he's been as successful as he has, because this is literally his passion. This is his everything. And it really shows in the way he speaks, the way he, his knowledge that he puts across. And, I can't thank Graham enough for his time, because this episode is going to be a two-part, like the Ben Pearson episode, because I just think in terms of the knowledge that there is, I just think it's better to split into two different parts. So as I said, we spoke about the use of orthotics and why they can be a life sentence. We spoke about his training style, how he sort of became a coach, why he became a coach, why this specific training style, why certain aspects of his training style are lost when it gets to athletic performance. There's all these different things that we speak about that, especially for me as a coach, and probably some people who just enjoy training, this is a really insightful episode. There's a lot of key things you can take in terms of, the gym isn't just squat, bench, deadlift. The gym is exploring movement. It's exploring motion. It's how can you sprint? How can you incorporate jumps? These, these simple movements that we, for some reason these days, lose because we have all this equipment available in the gym. And yeah, Graham's fantastic. So I hope you enjoy this episode with him. Make sure to like, subscribe, share the podcast with anyone who may enjoy it, and yeah, give it a like and let me know your thoughts in the comments. So enjoy the episode.
So in the context of this podcast, what do you find, like, what is your endeavor? What's meaningful for you to create this podcast? And, what do you think is meaningful to have me on as a guest, so to speak?
So for me, I wanted to start a podcast because I'm really interested in high performance. So podcast has been like my main source of content, so to speak, for years. Like, I'll listen to hours on hours of podcasts a week, and I'm just really interested in not just listening to conversations with other people, but actually having the conversation myself. Like, for me, being from working in strength and conditioning and elite sport, doing what I'm doing now, it's very interesting to speak to individuals who are high performers or experts in their field, which is also obviously a version of high performance itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, and to have you on as a guest, I've been fascinated by the stuff you do in terms of the methodologies to your training is very different. And also you were one of the main people who got me into the idea of shoes are shit, basically. Like, the shoes that we wear are not made for our feet. And, then I adopted, obviously, like, wearing barefoot shoes and transitioning into that, and just I had a lot more consideration for what I was putting on my feet. So I wanted to speak to you about that, and then also from like a coach to a coach, speak about your training methodologies and how you go about coaching and things like that.
All right, that's awesome.
Yeah, cool. So you ready to get going? Well, we already have got going. So
absolutely, yeah. Feel free, whatever. Yeah.
So you're known as the Barefoot Sprinter, and that's how I recognized you online. And obviously you've come to this level of athletic ability, this knowledge base. So I just wanted to understand where your athletic journey began as when you were younger.
So I think the safest inroad to that is my athletic journey began because I was very unathletic, and so I think this is something about like internal psychology that I think I spend a lot of time considering these days that isn't always evident. And so what it almost seems to be across the board is anybody that demonstrates some level of proficiency on social media uh, generally has the internal experience of being the opposite. Now, I think athletics is a little bit different because there's certain just physical innate capacities that people just like they just can do something that seems to be natural to them, like they're just strong or they just have a connection with their body that seems to be natural. And but there's some quality of social media that I think lends itself to valuing people who can communicate their internal experience well. And so there's something about whether that's people that write, people that can create content, people that can educate, that coach. There's something about that, and I think that takes an understanding of the both sides of the equation in a sense. Like I was this thing and I lived the experience of being this thing, and now I am at least externally on this other side of having done this thing. And so what I think most people use social media for is some form of this kind of like voyeuristic looking into someone else's life to kind of see what it is. And so to the extent that I can describe what it's like to go through this process of trying to be more athletic. And you can see this with business coaches. And so it's almost like people that are coaches are almost describing what it was like to develop this thing. So, for example, Alex Hormozy, I think, does a really good job of describing what it's like to build a business. Look at Andrew Huberman, describes what it's like to understand the human body. It's like there are these fascinations that take people like as a passion, as an obsession, and that continues to like hold with them through life. So for me, I grew up at horrible eyesight, very poor eyesight. I think my parents noticed me sitting away from a very large TV screen about 2 feet away trying to watch it when I was about two. And, it is interesting because I think the quick assumption at the time was you got to put me in glasses, I have astigmatism, these corrective things. And so in a sense, they kind of correct the problem for you. And, this is something that I'll have to do more research on, as I come full circle, looking towards to have kids at some point in the future. But, the idea of like, we have a problem, let's go and correct it. And so that kind of, you'll see that idea feeds back through this pushback I have, and it kind of forms the identity of a barefoot sprinter. But, growing up, the tangible experience of growing up was like, I didn't have good eyesight. So like, I couldn't really see much. And so when you're wearing glasses, you can kind of take your hands and put them beside your head and you can block your peripheral vision because you get used to two things. One, everything is amplified. So I've yet to meet someone who's not legally blind that has worse eyesight than me. And so everything being farsighted, everything got amplified. So it was bigger. So everything looked bigger than it was. And there's a loss of this use of depth perception. So when I get used to trained that I can see through this plane that is in front of me and not to the side, you don't appreciate that you lose things like your depth perception, your ability to navigate in like a three-dimensional context. So like when things got dark at night or when things started moving fast and there's a lot of motion, like I couldn't really keep up with stuff. And so, that was like my experience growing up. So I wore rec specs. There's like these big goggles, plastic goggles with lenses that you wrap around your head. And then when I played football, I tried to play football when I was like third, fourth grade. You have these like wraparound lenses because you can't wear goggles when you're wearing a helmet. So like all these things that informed my athletic experience. And the problem was that I did not like sitting still, and I still don't. I don't like this idea of stillness. And so part of my expression, my psychology, my inner being feels at peace when I'm moving. So, this didn't lend itself well to going to school. So sitting down, like being in school, being in class, being told this is what you got to learn. And so I kind of was at odds with the teachers. I always wanted to move, and every teacher did not like me. But I excelled because I was intelligent enough to kind of like piece things together. But I was not a fun experience in class. I was always asking questions, always trying to like create some type of motion and movement. And so you see that just this like internal development where like I don't have a lot of physical capacity to be athletic, but I desperately want to move. And so this conflict. I think that conflict creates maybe the narrative for some level of like obsessive growth and development. So I go through this high school. The only sport I really played was track and cross country in middle and high school. And so like, by track and cross country, I mean like I'm on the 2 mile and the 5K thing, and I'm running slow. I'm not fast. I don't really know what I'm doing. No one teaches you how to run. You just get buy the new pair of shoes, and you just kind of progress through this thing. And then you get to college. The only place I really felt like I was at home was in the gym where I was training, and I started working at the gym, and ultimately I kind of like didn't know what I wanted to do, but I kind of settled on physical therapy, did a bunch of shadowing. And that was my first experience getting into the insurance-based process of the whole thing, where like a big insurance company tells you what to do. So ultimately, it's like this tension. It's like I want to go and train, I want to work out, I want to do this stuff, but I don't know how to do it. So all I'm really doing is train like a bodybuilder or doing powerlifting. It's kind of, very meathead pursuits. Just I didn't realize I was looking at bodybuilding.com and T Nation, some of these online forums, watching YouTube videos, listening to podcasts, trying to figure things out as I go. And then I meet a few influential individuals who kind of show me some of this stuff. I'm like, all right, this is how you run. This is how you sprint. Like, this is really cool. And my first job out of college, basically, I went and got a university degree just to be a glorified personal trainer. But I worked at this place. It coaches athletes. It was a D1 sports training, which is a franchise now. It's a big brand, a lot of gyms around the United States. And they worked with athletes. And I remember, I all of a sudden am thrust in this position. And I fell in love. I knew it was exactly where I wanted to be. But I show up and do my first class, and some kid comes up, all right, coach, what are you doing today? I was like, coach, like, you're probably more athletic than me. I'm talking to like 7-year-old. And so, I kind of go to this process. It's like, okay, I started taking the classes with the guy who owned the facility, and I'm learning and I'm growing. It was great. And so like, I kind of go on this journey of like, okay, well, I realized that like what I desperately wanted to be my whole life was this athletic capacity. I wanted to be this professional athlete that just looked cool, felt cool, was confident in their body, that just wasn't afraid of stuff. Like I'd always see these athletes that just looked so confident. They felt so like, assured. They looked like, oh, I could balance on one foot. I can jump and do these things. They felt in place in their body. And that's what it looked like on the outside. And so that kind of became this model of desires. Like I want to feel like I think they feel. And so, I just started to work on, all right, well, this is how you run. This is how you jump. This is how you do all this stuff. And I didn't even know how to walk well. Like I had a series of injuries, ankle sprain, patellar tendonitis, all kinds of things, like everything you can really go through, like from a non-life threatening injury. I had a certain variation of that. So shoulder dislocations, back, SI joint problems, all kinds of things. And so that kind of paired this, like, all right, I want to do this thing, but every time I try to do this thing, my body starts falling apart and the training I'm doing isn't fixing it. So it led me to this tension of like, well, let me take this background of all this anatomy and physiology I learned in college, because I had to take a bunch of different classes because I kept trying to go through different careers, and none of the prereqs actually overlap. So I took like 7 or 8 anatomy and physiology classes each. So I got a very good paradigm for the body. And then I kind of took that, sort of applied these things, and like, okay, well, what's going on? And that led to this process of like, I personally am striving towards this thing that is kind of pushing right at the edge of performance, meaning like I'm running as fast as I can, jumping as high as I can, even though those are not objectively fast or high. I'm getting a little bit better at it, and I'm having to temper this thing. I'm like, okay, I have to like back in this thing. So like, I didn't get the normal exposure to all this athleticism as a kid would, and maybe ancestrally we would have. And so you just see this. You see this progression where now it's like, years, I'm almost 30, and so a lifelong obsession with trying to be more athletic, navigating the realities of having to back in this thing that didn't necessarily come naturally to me, and then communicate it along the way. And here you are. So that kind of suited me well for this spot of life.
Yeah, I'm on a sort of similar journey as to what you were describing there, where you feel like you're falling apart with everything you try. So like I'm now at a point, because I've had a knee issue for a year, and I'm now at a point where I'm like backing everything off and just restarting again, which sometimes it's very hard to do. When like you've spent years, like probably when you're in your bodybuilding phase, you spent years building these like strong foundations in your squat, deadlifts, bench, whatever it may be. And to then have to go, I actually have to strip everything back to the basics. It's very hard. For the ego, it's very hard to do, but it's very good for the ego to do it. So yeah, I'm at a similar point where I'm, now it's like, can I just hold an ISO split squat rather than loading a bar and trying to do 10 reps, what have you? So it's just, it's very hard to do. So was it hard for yourself to bring it back and sort of strip the ego, strip everything back and start again?
I mean, in some senses, no, but it's not because I've got this like humble, altruistic, like omnipotent perspective on life. It's like, I just kept driving myself to the point where I didn't have another option. And so like there's this pattern in life, like it's the same thing with making changes to diet. Like I've had a pretty significant dietary changes in my life. And at this point, I don't really eat out that much, or at least, it used to be before, like I would eat healthy and then eat clean and have a cheat meal. And then eventually it's just like the cheat meals become so, like you get bloating, your body's upset. I'm so unhappy that it's like, I just don't even enjoy the pleasure to begin with. And so the same thing with like training, or if you're trying to run or you're trying to like squat, and all of a sudden it's like, this thing just hurts you to the point you can't do it anymore. And so, in some senses, I'll say, I, maybe because I'm not very tough, I have a lower pain threshold than other people. Like for David Goggins or some of the people I know, like Mark Bell, like they'll just they'll just run and they just keep going, and like their pain thing, it's like their pain sense is a little bit off. But they're like, I'm like, that would hurt me if you did that, and they just keep going. But I kind of get the point. I was like, all right, this is just not like I can do the thing, and it's the ego, like you said, the identity of like, well, I'm strong, so I should be able to do this. I should be able to squat or deadlift, do other stuff, but it's causing me pain. So now I'm like kind of doing the thing, but I can't even do the thing because it's too uncomfortable. And so I think there's a reality, whereas like pain is your first teacher, it's your first coach, it's the thing that informs it. Pain is the sensation. It's all it does is grab your attention and say, hey, I know you thought you were going to look at this, but we're going to pay attention to this. And it just grabs you and like reorients to say, this is the most important thing in your life. And I think for a lot of people, they pick up to the signpost and they get stuck there. And so this is, you really like, this is kind of what I've been working on more and more, because as I work with more clients and work with people, you realize that like pain isn't this simple thing of like, oh, my tissues are damaged. It's a really emotional and psychological experience, because pain it's broad, it's unquantifiable, it's individual, it's ubiquitous. Everybody knows what it is to be in pain, but few people, like, you can't really point to it. Like, so what ends up being is that the quicker you're able to attend to pain, the less damage you do to yourself, and the more adeptly you're able to make changes and adjust. And so, the hard part is that, so everyone has a first encounter with pain, and I think that really informs how your life is going to go, in a sense, because you bump into pain, and we develop this idea like pain is bad. It hurts. My knees hurt, for example, in your case. It's like, okay, right? So what do you do with that? And so some people, when they get to this point, they get scared, because maybe they have a scarcity mindset. They think pain is bad, so they just they shut down. They stop doing anything. They turn around and like, all right, well, I'm not going to work out anymore. And so and that's where you see people. They go, well, I used to work out, but my knees got really bad, so I stopped. And it's like, and then I started to gain weight, and it's if like you start to see this like. And it's not always that every sensation, but it's like there's a sensation that is ours to have worked through, and I think people get stuck there. And so some people make an identity around that. They define themselves by the pain, by their diagnosis. And so let's say you go to a doctor and they say you've got patellar tendonitis or Osgood-Schlatter, you name it, and they go, well, I would love to go do this, but I got patellar tendonitis, so I can't. It's like they kind of like, and they make their whole idea like they're best friends with their physio. They start to ice every night. They just manage this thing. That's a symptom treatment. And then there's some people who are able to step back and say, this pain just doesn't seem right, in a sense. Like I understand. I don't need to judge this, but it doesn't seem right. So maybe there's another path. And so those are the people that realize the process is not numbing and avoiding. The process is not turning around and going home. The process is of like listening to your pain, and for the lesson is trying to teach you. And I think for that, there is an opportunity for us to start to circumnavigate this roadblock in a way that it informs us on a direction. We realize in hindsight, the pain was us trying to walk into a wall without realizing that the door frame is about 3 feet to the right. And so what you get from that is, I think, a calibration. I think this is really the process where it lets you calibrate and figure out, where am I going with my life? Because if you look at it in perspective, let's just say you're squatting. Okay, so let's say you're super strong. You can squat 500 pounds. Great. That's still small compared to 2,000 pounds. And you still couldn't squat, one of the rocks of the pyramid. There's this like, we judge ourselves based off of like our comparison to other people. Like, I'm strong. Well, relative to what? Could you pick up a house? No. So how strong are you? It's like we kind of like, we go, I 315. I hit a 10-pound PR. Or I guess in your terms, be, 120 now or 140. It's like I had a 5-kilo PR. It's like, in the scheme of what? Or it's like, I think it's like, it is really important because we are material creatures, meaning we have flesh and bone, and we have the skin that holds everything together, in a sense. But there's also this like magical, for lack of a better word, magical component that does like create the experience of what it means to be a human. And I think we get stuck in the, like, we call it the secular or the material world, thinking, oh, I need to go and get 10 pounds stronger. Well, I'll be happier when I do this, when I'm fast, when I jump, when I make the team, when I do this stuff. And so that's to make more money, buy the car. Like it all falls in this thing. And so I think at some point, pain invites us to recalibrate our intentions with what really matters. And I think that's where you go to self-development and you start to see, all right, your body hurts. And this is where you can look at a true allegory of the body. It's like, okay, your knees hurt because you've been training in one style of movement for like as the majority of what you do, meaning you're not incorporating a breadth of understanding, meaning you're not looking what the human body is capable of, and you're not looking at the stresses you're putting yourself into. That leads you down the road of like, well, why do that? Because I want to be strong, because I want to be big, because my heroes look like this. And so you have to question your models of desire, why you do the things you do, why you don't listen to your body, why you push through the different things. And so, when looked at correctly, the pain becomes the first coach. And so that invites you on this process. But it is often not until people hit rock bottom, in a sense, that they get to that point. And then, even then, it's not guaranteed that they make a decision and moves in a proper orientation. There's a lot there, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. What I want to say on that is that, so this idea of, everything, what you were basically saying is everything is relative. And it's kind of like, when we measure like VO2 max, it's all well and good saying, oh, my absolute VO2 max is 65, that means I'm elite. And it's like, yeah, but you're like twice the size of everyone else. So it's not like, when you put it as a relative term, actually you're probably average compared to everyone else. So it's kind of like, it's all well and good being able to squat 500 pounds, but when you're, going up and down stairs and you're in pain, what's the point in that 500 pound squat? That's my realization in the past couple of months, is like, it doesn't matter what I can lift and whether I can lift it in a month or 2 months. It's, can I just go up and down the stairs without the pain?
Yeah.
And it's making that progression forward.
So the hard part about that is so most people, everyone goes through that experience, right? And so this is kind of this colloquial wisdom of like, just wait till you're 40. Just wait till you hear people say like, oh, it's like, it's this like acceptance of this mediocrity of like, well, at some point, all you care about is your health. And like, there is a truism in there. There is a truth that at some point, you don't want to sacrifice the greater, you don't lose the battle to win, you don't lose the war to win the battle, in a sense, is what they're getting at. But most people have this house inside this kind of like fixed mindset of, well, I'm just getting older, it is what it is. And so it's accompanied with the justification for losing the wonder that otherwise inspires them to do with their life, to be. And I think that's a sad piece. And the other side is that like there's this, it really is the first crisis for most people, because in a sense, let's just say we could break down like two different types of pain. There's like the overuse pain, and then there's the acute pain. Meaning there's the acute pain is I try to do something that I am obviously not in alignment with. Meaning I go and, great example. There's this guy who was coaching of these hockey kids years ago, and their parents this clinic, and it was like the end of the night, 9:00, and I had done this whole summer program. And the last week we were doing testing on max deadlifts, and so one of the kids had lifted 300 pounds, and his dad walks out, and so by this point, like we were trying to in a hurry, so I left the weights on the floor, went out to go to the field and do some running, and I looked back, and one of the coaches was like, "Oh, so and so hurt himself." I'm like, "Well, what happened?" Apparently, one of the dads walked out and said, "Well, my son picked this up." And I'm talking, this guy's obese. He's not in shape. He's wearing flip-flops and in cargo shorts. And he picks it up. He's like, "Oh." And so he's like, "Take a video of this." He goes, and on the video, which I think is a saving grace that he got video, because it's like, I didn't coerce him to do it. He goes, "This is 300 pounds and I'm going to pick it up." And so he picks it up, back, goes out immediately. He's on the ground. They call an ambulance. He can't, he survived, obviously. It wasn't like he didn't get paralyzed, but it was one of those examples. That was an acute injury because he just tried to do something that he was not in. There's no alignment, meaning like he was not in physical preparation for the thing he attempted to do. That's where you get this kind of like things snap, break, whatever. And since you get hit by a car, you're not in alignment for the impact of that thing. Then there's this overuse type of injury, which is like all right, you've been doing this thing, but you kind of are missing the signs. It's kind of like you're a little tone deaf. It's like, okay, I've been playing this sport, doing this thing for so long that I've like kind of gotten fixed, meaning I'm not changing with the times. It doesn't mean you have to give up your sport, but you're not paying attention to the changing inputs in your life. That could be, and it's not always that our physical bodies change as much as like the responsibilities we go. Let's just say you get an aging athlete. Well, what changes? It's not so much that they get older, although that's part of it. It's like, well, they're, let's just say they don't feel as their level on the team is not the same, so they're drinking more, they're doing a bunch of stuff that's not helping them, or they have kids, or they have a partner, or they have any number of things that are changing the inputs that are going, and so they're not adjusting to these things, meaning with any new responsibility in your life, you now have to adjust what it is that your priorities. And so I can't take it's the idea of like being alert and aware. And I can't just overuse training is like I'm under recovering more often than not. And so this kind of chronic pain that pops up, and it's like, well, it's like you look at people that are suffering from this thing, and you're kind of like, well, your body is falling apart because you're not paying attention to the demands of it, and you're trying to like, and there's almost an ego or thing underneath that, which is like there's something that's pushing them to ignore the sensation in the body. And I'm not saying that it's this perfect flow where we never get hurt, but it's kind of like um, maybe one of those is like touching an electric wire, and the other is like not picking up the fact that the water's got too hot, then you burn yourself, like you boil a frog in a sense. And so I don't quite have that one pattern down, but I think that's where you start to notice is like pain really is this thing. And if people aren't careful, that really, if they don't have wise counsel, they can let that really just, tackle them in a sense.
The I like what you said on the acute side of things. Like if your body isn't physically prepared to be there, it's gonna get injured. Something's gonna go. Like the guy, obviously his back went. And I spoke to a coach over here in Australia, Vic Hawksley. I'm not sure if you're aware of him. So he's quite big in the sort of strength through range. The idea of play is important in training, and to carry it on through adult life. And what we were talking about is that there's this transition into now in the recent couple of years of this idea of strength through length. And yeah, athletes are still, well, not just athletes and coaches are still very wary to incorporate it. Even though, for example, in like in American football, when some of the time when they're throwing the ball, they're short, like the range that their shoulders going into is is quite extreme, but yet they won't train through this extra length that they'll be getting into, which may then lead to injury, but then still they won't go into that length. And I think it's something that's becoming really important for people is to build this strength through length, but obviously not too quickly, because that is where the injury
So
will
one of
come.
the things that I think you nailed right there, which is interesting, is the idea of play. And I think that's why you so rarely see kids get hurt, is because they're always playing. And I think in a sense, play involves novelty of movement. And so you see someone that becomes a professional athlete or like a college or high school, high level athlete, it's like they stop playing. And I think when you stop playing is when you get hurt, because your body is like trying to go through this thing. And so in a sense, you know, what do you need to do? And so this is where I think, the idea of like, okay, strength through length is valuable, because what that's really saying is you need to be able to move through this range of motion. And, in some senses, when you're playing and you have a novel stimulus, you just cover that naturally, I guess, in a sense. You go to a gym, like a playground, for example, where there's monkey bars, you're swinging, you're rotating, you're falling, you're going down the slide, you're rolling on the ground. For most people, something like jujitsu, which is something I've been interested in recently, is a great example of that as well. But you look at rugby, Australian rules football, you just like all kinds of sports where there's just a lot of novelty, and that stops really becoming a meaningful stimulus when you start to specialize. And so by that point, like, oh, I'm a goalie in soccer, or I'm a quarterback in football, or I'm a forward. It's like you start to go through these different pieces, and you realize, okay, well, what have we lost? Well, we've lost the actual play. And so, how do we do this? So the question then becomes like, if you look at the entire strength and conditioning profession, it's how do we start to train the body in a way that we can maintain the obligations of the responsibility, meaning the obligations of your specific role, while then adding in some type of like stimulus around the board. And I think that's where it's interesting because then you start like, well, what should the gym be? It's like, okay, well, we kind of get focused. Yeah, I need to get strong. I need to go do these main lifts. And so that's part of it. Uh, I'm not, I obviously, I think if you get stronger squat and deadlift, like you develop overall strength relative to your body weight, that's valuable, especially for lower body. I think you need a lot of that. But I do think we've lost a good bit of this, like what the movement could be. For example, the Greeks, I think one of the earliest examples of like recorded structured exercise and training, they used sprinting and jumping as a form of strength training. Like if you go and you look at a max effort sprint or doing broad jumps, they would hold little weights in their hands and do repetitive broad jumps or the jump into the sand. That's really challenging. And I think that's one of those pieces when you stop thinking of that as like, okay, I got my leg day. What was your leg day? Well, squat, deadlift, leg extension. It's like, all right, well, what would it look like to put some sprints into that? That's scary because, like, oh, well, I do that in my sport. Like, do you really practice full out sprinting? Do you do speed work? Do you do deceleration, agility, plyometrics? It's like, well, no. So I think that's one piece, which is like that in itself covers a lot of motion, and it's actually very specific to the athletic skills you want in the field. And the other part is like when you go into the gym, so hence why I kind of have not been doing this, and I do think that this is a perspective that's been afforded by the years I spent doing the very boring strength work, squat, bench, deadlift. So I think there's definitely a point of that in a gym. Like it's not saying they're mutually exclusive, but I do think this idea of length is valuable because then you can start to take things like bands, cable machines, different attachments, and start to pull your body in these things. So for example, the shoulder, it's like, are you going to throw a football over and over again, or are we just going to start to attach a cable or band and allow the arm to pull back and lengthen through that upper torso in these positions? So getting into these long positions under load with consequence, because when you just do stretching and you just do like, all right, I'm going to stretch and hold this position and breathe, rarely is there consequence. And without consequence, the body doesn't make adjustments to the stimulus, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I feel like in sport, the idea of training has become too linear, so to speak, in terms of like, yes, there's we can do change of direction. We can do these like, these different things which aren't necessarily linear in fashion, but the idea that that's all we do. Like there's no, it's the same mobility routine week on week. It's the same lifts week on week. There's no alterations in like, well, today, like I might work a bit more on like my thoracic mobility, for example. There's just like, for me, it feels like when I was working in rugby, it was just too like every day before a pitch session, they just get the hurdles out. The lads would do this really unintentional mobility that they don't really care about doing, and on the sprinting, as you just said, like, are you really sprinting? We'd be, programming max sprints because obviously for a worst case scenario, you need to have done it at some point in a controlled environment. And they're like, oh, well, so they'll do maybe 60, 70% of a sprint. And there's not enough intention, especially at that higher level. I feel like they just stop. Some of them stop caring enough to be able to
and that's where I think you go back to this idea of pain. That's like the overuse thing. It's like it's kind of become a thing where like and then the overuse, it's almost always the case as some type of acute. When you look at like pro athletes, there's some type of acute injury is preceded by some type of like this ache, chronic stiffness, tightness, like what you could consider an overuse pain. And the overuse pain is just like something is changing. So like there are fixed, and this is the part of, let's call it the rub between, let's say, a fixed identity, a fixed social expectation, meaning like I have made a building, for example, stands, and there's right angles and there's structures and foundations. So the building has a purpose, and you can't really change that. But then, that it kind of stands in stark contrast to, let's just say, the people who would flow in and out of that building in a sense. So like you may build a building with an idea and say, this is what it's going to be, but rarely, that's why I think the idea of open concept teams seems to be taking over more, because you have like, oh, we have all these rooms, these partitions, but well, the wall becomes an impediment. And so like the idea of a warehouse is interesting, but you do look at like people are this seasons, nature. I think people are an interesting combination of nature and structure in a sense. There's the logos, there's this idea of like, intertwined knowledge and the ability to structure and order things with this also chaotic image of nature that is constantly changing and moving in this spiral of fittest. And there's this interaction of these two, let's say, opposing forces that kind of like yin and yang, so to speak. And I think that's where you look at it and say, okay, well, I've got this fixed contract, meaning I am a player, I'm a professional athlete for 3 more years. So I have to keep showing up and do this stuff. And it's like, within that, okay, there are responsibilities that you need to set aside this and go through this stuff and realize that I've given this. But it's also when you start to look at the pain, is saying, what part of this, where is what's distracting you? What is taking your attention? What is pulling you off of traction for the thing you said you wanted to do? Which that to me seems a much more interesting test of the longevity of an athlete than it is the physical body, because it just seems to me we have this narrative that if we find the exact right training modality, the exact right strength to weight ratio, the exact right like movement and speed, and we want to geek out and think we could solve with more structure. It does seem to me interesting because I was talking to my girlfriend about this the other day. She's a gymnastics coach, and she was there's an adult class that she'll oversee on occasion, and there's the people doing tricking, and tricking is this kind of like interesting phenomena where people go out into an open space and like jump and do backflips and they kick the feet around. They're all kinds of weird stuff. And she made the comments, she's like, I don't know how these people just don't get injured. They're laying at all kinds of weird angles. Their knees are going in, their ankles are going in. And it's almost as though like their bodies are prepared to not get injured because their intention is set on going to try. And I'm sure people have gotten injured for sure, but it's like you go look at something like a very what would see a harmless, I'm making a cut and I'm adjusting, but I'm playing a sport, and like an ACL tear. How many non-contact ACL injuries versus people that are flipping around, and they're, it's just interesting to look at the psychology behind this stuff and then saying like, am I playing and am I having fun? Do I feel safe or like capable? Am I in alignment with the thing my body wants to do? Or is there more of I'm pushing myself to do something and ignoring the little things that are popping up? It's just, that strikes me as meaningful. And that at this point in my life and coaching, I tend to find more and more meaning in pursuing those questions. Again, I don't know where it leads, but it is interesting to look at those things of like, for example, in your situation, let's just say your knees are hurting. There is an interesting reliance on, I'm going to go back to try and solve the same problem with the same set of tools that caused the problem. Say, okay, well, I'm going to go, I can't squat anymore, so I'm going to do a split squat. And don't get me wrong, I was there. I had this horrible patellar tendonitis for over a year and a half, and I started when I was doing the squat every day, but I had no form. I wasn't doing the long range stuff, this length. I wasn't really doing any mobility work. I didn't have good form, didn't have good core bracing, and so it was kind of overloaded one portion of the body. It just kept getting worse and worse, and so it was squat 7 days, and it was squat 5 days, then it was squat 4 days, then 3 days, then 2 days, then 1 day, and it was like I kept trying to fix it through the same means that hurt it, and there's value in that, but also a question to be asked of, well, potentially there's something to be learned from stepping back and exploring, because you'll fix it through movement, right? So the hard part is like within the house of movement, that is how you find a resolution. But the idea of loading and putting yourself in the same context, that seems to be an interesting question I don't think many people ask themselves because they don't want to let go of the ego with identity.
Yeah, it's quite, so what you're saying about the knee, obviously, and you'll always fix it through exercise. So yesterday I went to see a knee specialist, and you'll laugh at this. So I was in there for all of 15 minutes. He manipulated my knee about 2 or 3 times and said, I was like, right, so what should I do? He goes, take 6 months off. I was like, 6 months off what? He was like, everything. I was like, you're telling the wrong person this. I was like, that's like, it's lucky I have the background I do, because I went away and then I thought about it, and I sent this email, like, I was quite unsettled by the fact that a specialist has told me this, given me this really bad advice. And so he invited me back, and I had a discussion with him. I was like, look, I understand you've got your credentials, you've done your education, this, that, the other, but that's some of the worst advice I've ever been given in my life. Like,
I can't grasp how you've not taken the specific context of like, I have a very active lifestyle. Exercise is everything for me. It's not just a physical thing, it's the mental thing of exercise. And I was like, you're telling that person to just take 6 months
And
off
hope
everything.
it works. That's the thing.
Exactly. I was like, there's no return to play protocol almost, where like, usually after an injury, there's always this protocol you put in place where you're like, right, so I can get back to 100%, I will try 20, I'll try 30, I'll try 40, and so on. And you're just going, take 6 months off and go right back to it. I was like, and I just paid $180 for that. I was like, so this is just baffling. So it's also, I think, especially when you're not just at the professional level, but when you bring it down to the general population, if someone's then getting that advice and they don't know, they're actually going to go and do it. And then they're going to come back, get injured, and the same cycle's going to go over and over, and they'll just give up. They just won't exercise. And obviously that leads to then other issues.
So this is where I think, it's ironic. I got hit with some level of an inspiration yesterday to just, as I was training and moving, is most of the training you'll see me do now is not necessarily training with an intent, meaning I'm not trying to get stronger, bigger, faster. I'm trying to move better and like get better at patterns, and I have something, but most of it's exploration because, I think the only thing that there's a certain amount of paternalistic credentialism that is epidemic in, let's say, the insurance-led medical health provider, professional marketplace. So there's just like, oh, I'm going to do this. And the hard part is that you can't find the answer for something you're not looking with the question of, meaning you can't, like, if you've stopped being interested. And that's the hard part, is that most people go into this stuff because they at some point liked movement, like people wanted to help do this stuff, but they kind of got the degree and thought, well, that's it. And in some sense, the degree just signifies that you've done a bit of thinking about a subject, but we kind of over rely on that instead of looking at, well, are you still doing the thing? Are you still pursuing? Are you trying to run? Are you trying to be an athlete? Because without that, you stop looking under places, because you can't. The question: you can't teach a man that which he thinks he already knows. You can't teach someone what they think they already know. And there's a bit of that where it's like you'll walk in and a doctor or a specialist, even worse, it's just a person. Like, he's just a person. And so it's not that he doesn't have stresses or arguments with his partner or he needs money or whatever. It's like when you get to the point where most of the treatment that's on offer is just telling you to stop doing doing anything, of course, like, oh, if you don't ski anymore, you won't hurt your knee again. It's like, but that's easy for you to say. And this is, epidemic when you see like orthotics being advised, restrictive shoes, braces, pads, pills, shots, procedures, and some of the stuff, there's some merit to it, but, I think there's a loss of, let's say, wonder in people in a sense. And you probably just received, in his younger days, I'm assuming he probably would have been much more interested to like go work with that stuff. But now he's got to see a certain number of people, get insurance, or whatever the constraints are. But there's this narrative that's been said that people just don't care. There's no compliance. People don't care anymore. They just, like, the best thing you could do is manage them like a parent, get them to take their pills and do something. It's like, he has absolutely no faith that you would do anything. So therefore, because that's the perspective he sees things in, he stops even asking the question and trying. And it's tough, because then you as the person can walk out of what you thought was just asking for advice or help from a professional with a diagnosis. And for anybody that walks out, oh, I've got patellar, early onset arthritis, or I've got, osteopathy of the, I don't know, like, you name of any of these fun Latin words and just go through the whole process. But it's like, people walk out and they go, yeah, I got this thing and it sounds serious. And the doctor said I can't do anything for 3 months. It's like, that's your plan? Just do nothing? And that's hard, because it makes people victims. It turns them into this thing. And movement's always the answer, but it's hard because, like, the hope in going to see a medical professional is that they're able to see the context that you're in with a bigger perspective and say, all right, these are the options, these are the things we want to do. But it's turned into, well, here are the external solutions that I can apply to you. I can do this procedure, I give you this pill, I give you this product, and that's it. And none of those are empowering for you as an individual. And you would hope that they could say, all right, but the thing is, you wouldn't go to a personal trainer and say, hey, I got knee pain, because you've been taught that, well, this is a pain problem. This is for the specific specialist. You need to go to a knee specialist, a physical therapy, a chiro, and like, so, but then those people aren't engaging in the type of solution that could empower you to help heal yourself. And it's a very difficult thing. And so you just see this like this dichotomy that gets you as the individual consumer get pulled in the middle. And I understand that because I've been there. I live that. Like I understand what it's like, and it sucks.
Yeah, it's definitely a shit one. But you mentioned orthotics there as well, like, so obviously insoles for shoes and what have you. So I want to transition on to this idea of barefoot. So A, what is the problem with orthotics in your opinion? And B, people who are wearing them, how can they transition out of them?
So the reason I chose like the name, the Barefoot Sprinter, it was suggested to me, but I really, it stuck with me, was the idea that like, I'm not a huge barefoot runner, meaning I don't go out and like run all the time barefoot. There's a certain masochism that's required for that I just, like sometimes the ground is not what I want to run on, barefoot. So like I'm a fan of shoes, don't get me wrong, and I think the shoes are great technology that allow you to do a lot of stuff. I do think that sprinting is the highest form of athletic expression, and I think that being able to do it barefoot implies that there's a lot of stuff the body can do, and I think that's really powerful. So ultimately, the story about orthotics and around feet is one of human potential versus human limitation. Obviously, anyone can point to the fact that it hurts to step on a rock or that some things aren't safe. Like, okay, sure, I understand that. But there's an opportunity to look and say that this thing that we've been told, not even told anymore, it's so enculturated that your feet are weak, fragile, and unhealthy and incapable, that they need support. And so you look at this, it's like I think we're in the trillions of dollars. I think we're actually 4 billion. We're $4 billion on orthotics worldwide in a sense, and it's like that's a fraction of the overall shoe market, but it's like this is a massive market where people are spending tons and tons of money. In comparison, or like you have to understand this fact that people are spending an incredible amount of money on orthotics while the shoe technology, quote unquote, is getting better. So the idea of orthotics is based off the idea that your feet aren't strong. And some people are born with flat feet, they're not capable, they're not strong, they don't have the ability to support themselves. And so you need a shoe or some type of exogenous support to be able to keep your feet from hurting. And the ironic part that we seem to all have forgotten is that we evolved and developed over millions of years without any type of shoe or foot support. So somehow in the last, really since 1970, which the first, say, foam-soled shoe came out in 1972, you look at this and you think, okay, well, the last 50 years, we've had a massive marketing that's told us that everyone needs to wear shoes all the time. So underlying that is like, okay, for people who have foot pain, almost always because their feet, let's say, don't get stimulation anymore, then there's some type of band-aid that they need to have that. So let's say they block the input. The hard part is that what you get is a broader sense of, and I think this is why the conversation of pain is pertinent, because you look and you say, in response to pain, what should we do? Now, should I step back and look at this broader circumstance to see what's weak and what I should address, where I need to develop strength? And it really is strip the ego away and build up from a base foundation. Or do I just continue to put Band-Aids and numbing agents on top of it because I don't want to feel in the sensation? For most of, let's say, the ideal opportunity would have been, as kids growing up, they're able to spend time barefoot walking and develop their feet. If you look at kids, their feet function like hands. You can press in, they can grip, they have ability to use their toes and bend. Their feet are developing in this very sensorial feedback mechanism. And you see that the hands and the feet and the face have the highest sensory input, the most nerve endings in the body. They're very rich. They would have been how we perceive the world. And so as part of that, the first lesson of being told the world's unsafe is you get put shoes on because you might get hurt. You might step on something. And so it's a lesson that gets ingrained that the world isn't safe. You're not strong. You're not capable. You need something to protect you. And so you see this very deeply. And so people don't ask about orthotics unless they're in pain or they're afraid. And pain and fear go really closely tied together. And so what you see is that there's a belief that my feet can't do it. And so the ironic thing is that your feet and your hands are pretty much mirrored in terms of their anatomy. So the feet have 26 bones, hands have 27. They have the same number of digits, the articulation joints, and they've got a forearm, wrist, finger setup that is just like the shin, ankle, foot. The same thing, same buildup. One is just used to standing on them. And so when you're walking around, you're on hard and comfortable, painful surfaces, sure, wear shoes. But when that's your go-to, then what you end up losing is A, the ability to process sensory feedback from your feet, and B, the mechanical strength. So your grip strength. If I wanted to go and hang and do a dead hang or pick up something or grab a ball or, like even carry groceries, I need some level of grip strength. And so it's ironic because grip strength is one of the tests they use to see how close people are to death. Not because it's a great test, and as some of your research is showing, just because it's convenient. Like I can, hey, grip this and then move on. And so in the same sense, if someone had weak grip strength, you wouldn't put them into finger or hand cast or an oven mitt. You'd have them work on their grip. And we very much get that. But yet somehow, because it's very profitable for the shoe companies and orthotic companies, medical device and all this stuff, that isn't there. And the incentive behind that isn't to try and hurt people. It's just there is a belief that humans are weak and fragile and we can't do things. And so we are materialized limits. And so all that to be said is, like, if you're wearing orthotics, the question is, what is the purpose of that orthotic? If it's to keep you out of pain, then you have to understand that that's like a crutch that you're assigned if you break a leg. It's a valuable thing while you are trying to heal the actual physical tissue and let the bone like join back together. But if I saw you in a crutch and you said, "Oh, I broke my leg 5 years ago," it's like you would assume something really bad happened. So the point is that a short-term acute use of an orthotic can be appropriate in some settings when you're recovering from severe pain, but the vast majority of it is just a symptom treatment. So an orthotic is simply not a long-term solution. It is just something that is a short momentary thing to get you out of pain. And that the problem is, even though that does get you out of pain, it comes at a longer-term expense. As you continue to weaken your foot, the tissues get less movement and you become stiff. If you've ever had a wrist problem where you've been in a brace at any point of any joint in your body, you notice how quickly you lose strength, you lose muscle mass, and you lose the movement that would hydrate the tissue. Same things happen to your feet. So short term, they can have a use case, but they are not a long-term thing. And if you've been prescribed an orthotic without an egress, meaning a way to get out of it, that means that you've been given a life sentence. The way you get out of that is very simple. You have to move your toes, and you engage in very simple exercises, rolling your feet, moving the toes, doing some manual work like putting your hands between your fingers between your toes to get circulation there and build up. But as you said earlier, it requires a stripping away of the ego so that you are starting to not judge yourself. Say, "Oh, this is so stupid, I have to do this." Like, no, I'm going to build up the thing I would have gotten as a child and start to build up little by little by little to get out of this thing. Does that make sense to answer your question?
Yeah. What you were saying there about rolling out your feet and stuff, people will think like, oh, I need to be in a gym setting, this, that, the other, when actually you can literally get a lacrosse ball, a cricket ball, what have you, something that's slightly hard, or even, I don't know, like just something that's hard but misshaped to the floor. Just stand on it at home as you're cooking. Just maybe stand on it in different positions on your foot and manipulate it so that you find the sensation maybe just under the arch of your foot, and you're like, oh, maybe I'll just spend a minute or two here. And it's the thing of like, you're saying maybe put your fingers in between your toes and hold that and manipulate them. If you can't get between all toes, go between two. And then once that becomes comfortable, do 3 and 4 and so on. And I think a problem as well with feet that's coming to fruition now is the carbon fiber plated shoes, which are meant for elite, well, not just elite, but marathon runners,
competitive athletes,
5K runners. Yeah, the people that I see all the time now, people are wearing them just to go shopping. But a carbon fiber plate, when you're not using it for performance, is basically like wearing a cast for your foot. There's no movement in them whatsoever. I've got a pair for running. There's absolutely no movement in them whatsoever. But people aren't aware of it. They don't have an understanding of that this thing is literally meant for performance and performance only, not for you to be wearing down to the shops.
So that brings up the shoes. And so I think there's 3 categories of shoes. There's the competitive shoe, the aesthetic shoe, and the training shoe, or like the everyday shoe. The competitive shoe, you're sacrificing one aspect of a healthy shoe, which there are 4. There's flat, meaning the heel and toe are on the same level. They're wide in the toe box, meaning your toes can wiggle. They're flexible, meaning you can bend and roll them up without much strain. And they're thin. That's the least important because it's okay to have some padding, but they're thin enough for you to feel the ground is ideal. So those 4, if you sacrifice one or more of those for a specific competitive advantage, that's a competition shoe. So for example, the carbon fiber plate sacrifices the flexible aspect. That means that when you step, you have more, it works with you to resist the bend, and it kind of shoots you forward like a little bit of a blade. Now, that's fine if you're training for competition, because competition and health are not synonymous. They're not the same thing. And so if you are trying to push yourself past the point of what is healthy, then yeah, that's okay. But that is not an everyday thing. And so the point is understanding that if I make trade-offs, then I need to go and have a conversation with my body and do some of this work after, which is the value of soft tissue work and taking care of yourself, which could be done at home and kind of an everyday thing. It's like a mobility part. Then if you look at the other parts, a training everyday shoe is really going to be, an aesthetic shoe just looks a certain way, and it almost always sacrifices multiple things just to look. But you can make the argument that looking good is competition in some aspects. If you're going on a date or whatever, then sure. Like, I'm not going to sit there and say, what's right or wrong, but I will say that a healthy foot is able to wear a shoe like that and bounce back quickly. It's just a question of, do you really want to be wearing a specific type of shoe, raised heel shoe that's stiff, to work every single day? It's like, there's better ways to do that. This is where you go and you look at a shoe should be built for the foot, not the other way around. But most often we're told that, this is the way a shoe should look. Now fit your foot into it. That's a problem. So what you want to think about is, if I'm looking at a shoe, it allows my foot to be a foot. You want something that's going to be flat, wide, flexible, and thin. That's going to be the baseline of, okay, we go into a conversation about what shoe should I wear. It's like, well, is it comfortable? Not really the question you want to ask first. Like, does it let your foot move? Like, does my foot have the capacity to move? Is the more valuable thing. Does this thing impede function? And so, like, if we go functional within that, you start to figure these things out. But I think we've got a limited perspective on comfort, because, like, well, what does it feel like? We just think really by that is it long enough? We don't think, is the shoe wide enough? Because you look this way, you look at the incentives that will drive people to lose options without realizing it. He'll say, if I am a shoe company and I have to make a SKU, I have a certain amount I have to make a few thousand pairs of shoes. Can I really afford? And, it's enough to have a last that measures for, in America, the size 10, 10 and a half, 11, 11 and a half. So it's sizes and half sizes, but you don't ever see, it's just not common to see a width, even though people have different width shoes, and men have wider proportional feet than women, for example, but you don't see like narrow, wide, and narrow, normal, and wide. Like, that would be great, but you don't see that. So you just see one SKU, because it costs money to have a size 11 shoe and 3 different, now you think, okay, I've got 30 different size or 20 different sizes of shoes, and each of them has a different width. That's 60 different SKUs I have to create in different colors. It's just not profitable. And so they're like, we'll just kind of pick some in the middle. And then if you have a wide shoe, or like it happens to be so that when you have a raised heel, it slides your foot forward, and the narrow toe box coming together keeps your foot from coming out, even though that means you're coming to a point. And for whatever reason, there's an aesthetic appeal to the pointed toe that looks, people like elf shoes, I guess, but like there's an aesthetic appeal that people choose that. So you start to see this conversation where people are making decisions based off a very limited constraint of comfort, because they don't realize that, like, okay, well, the height of my shoe matters, the height of my foot, meaning like how high it is. Like, I have a really fat foot, so like it's too high for most shoes, the arch, so to speak. And then you look at the width. If you have strong foot, like your foot will change shape just like your hands. If you do grip work, you do running, you do start to do the strength work for your feet. So then, of course, you get people wearing shoes that don't fit them, they don't serve them. Their feet get stiff, tight, and weak, and then they go to the doctor. And what does the doctor say? Well, we're going to send you to a specialist. And that specialist is a podiatrist who literally is gone to school in an education system that's funded by the very companies that sell orthotics. So I have podiatrists reach out to me, and the first line of suggestion, the first line of like fixing things out is get you an orthotic first, then we'll figure out the rest of it later. And most people, like, that's kind of like saying, all right, we got a problem, you got a fever, here's some ibuprofen, you come back and we'll figure out the next part when you feel a little bit better. They go, I feel better, I don't want to take anymore. It's like, you start to just see that. So it's not just a one-sided thing, but there's a set of incentives on both sides, and there's an underlying lack of, the more you respond, just to tie this back into the pain conversation, the more you train people that pain is bad, and they don't see it as a doorway, an inroad to becoming better and becoming more of themselves, in a sense, like developing, then they just say, the quicker I got rid of the bad thing, that's good, right? I got rid of the bad thing, and they just shut it down. And so you get incentives to sell and to get people into certain things and to, push a certain narrative, and then people buy that and they think, all right, I got the pain, I'm doing good, and it's just hope it doesn't come back. And hope is not a strategy.
Thank you to Graham for his time. Obviously, part 2 will be coming out a week on Monday, so at 6 a.m. British time and then 5 p.m. Australian Eastern time. Please make sure to share the podcast with anyone who may be interested, as I can't expand and grow the podcast without your help. So please make sure to do that, and I appreciate each and every one of you who watch the videos and listen to them and watch the clips and all that sort of stuff. So thank you so much, and I will see you next week for another video.